Hi, and welcome to Chapter 3.1 of Art Appreciation Arts 1301. It's me, your instructor, George Neal. Okay, so we're about to kind of shift gears a little bit in this course. We spent the first approximately half of this course talking about sort of the basics of art, talking about learning basic terminology and vocabulary, learning the elements and principles of design, and then learning about the basic materials and methods to make art with. Now we're going to look at the history of art, and we've already, kind of covered a little bit of history. I mean, it's impossible to talk about famous works of art without touching on the history of it. But we're going to do this in a more sort of concentrated, concerted way. We're going to start at the very beginning of art history, around 40,000 BC or so, and then we're going to move all the way up to the modern day by the end of the semester. But today's lecture is primarily going to focus on ancient art. We're going to look at the art of what we call the Paleolithic period. Then we're going to look at the art of the ancient Mediterranean area and Egypt. And then next chapter we're going to look at Greece and Rome. So we're going to be covering the ancient world basically this week. So let's just jump on in. We're going to start sort of here in Europe, and by the end of today's lecture, we're going to be here in Mesopotamia, looking at various cultures of the ancient world. Prehistoric art in Europe and the Mediterranean. The first artworks made by humans comes as early around as 40,000 years ago. So around 40,000 BC or so, human beings started to make the first, what we could call art. Humans had been making art for about 40,000 years, or making designs about 40,000 years before this in implements like axes and weapons and things like that, sort of geometric patterns. But they had been making representational art, pictures of things, until around 40,000 BC or so. And these will come in the form of paintings on cave walls and sculptures. The main subject matter are going to be things that were vital to survival, so food and procreation. And these give us an important record of our lives of our ancient ancestors. So we're going to be looking at a period called the Paleolithic. So Paleolithic, what was Paleolithic? What is the Paleolithic period? Well, it literally comes from the Greek terms meaning old stone, Paleolithic. So it literally means the old Stone Age. And this is a term used by archaeologists to describe the different kinds of stone tools that were used in this period. So Paleolithic. And this is a long, long period in history that ends around 12 to 10,000 BC. The Paleolithic also covers the time period of an ice age. So throughout most of the world, and especially in the parts of Europe that we're going to be looking at, the world was more or less in a state of permanent or semi-permanent winter. It was extremely cold. Our ancient ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They tended to be nomadic. There are no real permanent settlements. They might occasionally stop and stay in some places, maybe seasonally, living in caves. But for the most part, human beings used temporary shelters made out of animal skins and bones and things like that, that could be portable because they had not developed agriculture, and they needed to follow herds of animals around or to cultivate raw fruit and vegetables from wherever they grew. So they couldn't be stationary. So there are no sort of permanent villages or things like that. However, a lot of the images we see do come out of caves. So even though these caves would not have been settlements per se where people lived year-round, they were certainly seasonal places that people would come back and visit. And as we're going to find out, these caves often had probably spiritual purposes, as we'll see. So the earliest images come from a cave in Spain called El Castillo. in Cantabria, Spain, and they consist mostly of, well, images of animals and handprints that you can see here. These are actually made by taking powder, different pigments. So in this case, various kinds of umbers or dried clays or mineral pigments, and grinding them up, and then putting them in a reed, putting one's hand against the wall, and then taking the reed and blowing this powdered substance onto the wall. It sticks to the cave wall because there is either animal fat or even spit and saliva placed on the wall to hold this stuff in. Now, how do we know how old this stuff is? We know how old it is because of a carbonate mineral called calcite that has formed on top of this painting. So we use a method now called carbon-14 dating that basically measures the half-life of this isotope of carbon-14, and it's really regular. Basically, it basically dissolves at a very consistent rate, or decays at a very distant rate, and we can get a pretty good idea of how something old is by the decay of this isotope. So we know that anything that is below this layer of calcite on top of the image has to be at least as old as the calcite, right? We can't date the drawing itself, but we can date the deposits on top of it. So there's a possibility that these images could actually be older than 40,000 years, but we know they have to be at least 40,000 years old. Okay, so this is very typical in the sense that this of lots of cave art, in that it's made from natural materials, minerals, clays, things like that, and then also human or animal products like fat and spit to act as a kind of a binder. I find the Paleolithic period fascinating because it was a period of time that was very difficult for early human beings. We were especially in Europe, the regions that we're looking, because we were hunter-gatherers. We were nomadic. We had to travel around. Infant mortality rates were very, very high. Babies often and usually did not survive. Most people didn't survive past their 20s. I mean, typically you were an old man or an old woman if you made it to the ripe old age of 25. It was a very difficult life. And yet, despite these hardships, human beings found the need to make images. Why? We're not exactly sure. And how long had human beings been making images? Once again, we don't quite know because a lot of the probably earliest images were made using non-permanent materials, impermanent materials. So things like taking a stick and drawing in the ground, things like that, maybe using chalk or other kinds of minerals to draw on rocks on the outside, and it would wash away with rain or wind or erode or whatever. So we don't really know how long the tradition of making images occurred for before these images that we have discovered. But these images that we have found in caves are really well preserved because they're protected from the elements, they're protected from sunlight, so they have survived. But they may not represent the earliest images made by human beings. They just represent the earliest images that we still have. And you're looking at a detail of a cave art from a cave called Altamira in Spain. Altamira is a fascinating cave, primarily because it was the first ever discovered by modern humans, and it was discovered completely by accident. Marcelino Sanz and his daughter, a little girl named Maria, were on their property in Spain, walking around, and the little girl sees a little hole leading into the ground. This brave little child, who's, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old or so, squeezes in where her father couldn't, and she finds herself in this chamber, a rather large chamber. She's kind of dwarfed by the ceiling, and she hears echoes, and it's pitch black. And all she has in her little hand is this pale little lantern. She holds it up. She looks up at the ceiling, and she sees something. She sees these mysterious forms. And as she stands on her little tippy toes and gets closer, she realizes that they're pictures. Really, really, really old pictures. And as her father eventually comes in with her and they bring in more light, they realize they're looking at images of bison. They're looking at these large animals. And these are large pictures. These aren't tiny images, but these are 5 foot or so pictures. So they're, about half life size or so. Half scale images of these actual animals. And they are blown away by them. And they go to their local university and their local historical societies. And this is, in the 1870s, 1880s in Spain. And they say, I think we found something really, really old. And they're basically laughed off. A lot of people are convinced that they're trying to pull a prank or a hoax. That these images don't really, they're not ancient, they're actually modern, and they're not made by our early ancestors. They look too good, they're too well preserved. There's no way these could be ancient works of art from our prehistoric ancestors. And a few decades later, when the technique of carbon-14 dating is invented, these paintings are analyzed, and Maria and her father were proven right. That these are actually ancient works of art. Now, Altamira, the cave, the paintings were made towards the end of the Paleolithic period, around 13,000 to 11,000 BC, or BCE, as you'll see. Let's talk about that really quickly. So, you'll sometimes see in books the term BCE instead of BC. BC, of course, means before Christ. But in the academic world, where we often have an international community of scholars, many who are non-Christian, we use this more generic secular term, BCE, which means before Common Era. And it means the same thing as BC, and I don't care which term you use. It doesn't matter to me, but I just want you to get used to seeing this term, because this is the delineation you'll see used in most textbooks. And then you'll also see, instead of AD, you'll see the term CE. So AD, it does not mean after death, but AD actually means Anno Domini, which is the Roman term, the Latin term meaning year of our Lord. Anno meaning year. Domini, meaning of our Lord. So the year of our Lord. So instead of AD, you'll often see the term CE, which means Common Era. So before Common Era and Common Era, BC, AD, I don't care what you use, just know them both. So, okay. All right, guys. So, these are very much towards the end of the Paleolithic era, but they're still very, very old. These things are, 13,000 years old, approximately. And these are very typical of the kinds of images we'll see in Paleolithic cave art. They're large scale. They are of animals. This is the primary subject of Paleolithic art, are animals. We rarely see humans in paintings. We'll see sculptures of humans, but we hardly ever see paintings of humans. And when we do, they're very abstract. But images of animals tend to be very realistic, very lifelike, and very large. Okay, so why animals? Well, one of the theories is that these are food source animals, and that certainly makes sense. In some of these images, like in this image from the caves at Lasko in France, we see a horse being hunted with arrows or spears being thrown or shot at it. So these could be food source animals. And some of them were, but some of them were not. In fact, most of the animals that are pictured, with some significant exceptions, are mostly animals that were not eaten. These were animals that were too large or too swift or just difficult to hunt. when you take into account the kinds of technology and weapons that our ancestors had at that time. So, pardon me. It's been a long day, guys. So typically, with some major exceptions, these are typically all powerful animals. You never see small animals. You'll never see like a bunny rabbit or a squirrel in these ancient Paleolithic paintings, but instead you will see large animals, powerful animals, horses, oxen, bison, different kinds of wildcats, things like that. This is from Lasko, which is one of the largest and most extensive of the Paleolithic caves. There's somewhere around 6,000 images throughout this very complicated cave system. And I want you to keep something in mind as we look at these. These cave images were not easily seen. They were hidden, oftentimes deep within a cave system, sometimes, a tenth of a mile or even further deep. They were often in very difficult to reach places. You had to sometimes squeeze through very small areas. They weren't necessarily accessible to everyone, and it would have been incredibly dark in here. You would need a torchlight to see, because it's basically pitch black because you were very, very far away from sunlight. So the question is, why? Why create images that are difficult to see in places that are hard to get to? Why animals? Why put them on the ceiling? Because most of these are on the ceiling. Why powerful animals? Why on a large scale? And our best guess is that these probably had religious connotations. These animals were either represented sort of like spiritual forces, or maybe were perhaps worshipped as gods or deities themselves. We don't exactly know, because we're dealing with prehistory, meaning that we have no written information. But we do know that these were important. And also think about the effect of walking into a cave, right? You walk into this cave with your torchlight. As you walk deeper and deeper, crawling sometimes, in very dangerous, precarious areas, you get to this large chamber deep within a cave. All of a sudden, it's almost more like a temple or a church, isn't it? It's like this sacred, beautiful, hidden space. And as you enter with your torchlight, imagine the way that dances around on the ceiling. And imagine these magnificent, powerful beasts, these forces of nature flickering and moving above you. It would have been incredible, wouldn't it? And then imagine even the sounds of the cave. There probably would have been some sort of chanting going along. And you're inside a big, empty, echoey chamber. These are special effects, right? These are meant to evoke a kind of spiritual mindset, a spiritual, sacred space is what we're looking at. And these animals represent some sort of divine power. Now, were these worshipped as gods? Were these feared as demons? We don't know. We have no idea of the kinds of rituals that were performed, except they probably involved some sort of sacrifices, because there are fire pits that have been found near these images. So, things might have been burnt, what we call burnt offerings. Things burned in a fire might have been made to appease these gods or whatever they are. But ultimately, we can only guess. One thing you will notice about most of these images, it doesn't matter what cave system we're looking at, but the animals are often shown overlapping each other, sometimes even drawn on top of each other. These images aren't meant to show us like a group of animals. So don't think of it this way. You're not looking at one scene involving a bunch of animals hanging out together, but instead you were seeing images that were laid on top of each other over a period of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years. That's what's mind-blowing about some of these images, is that they were created over a span of tens of thousands. I mean, like the oldest caves we have are around 40,000 years old. The youngest caves we have are around 11, 12, 13,000 years old. So there's a 30,000 year difference between the oldest cave art and the last cave art. 30,000 years is an incredible amount of time. I mean, that's longer than, modern civilization. That's like 5 times longer than civilization has existed. So we're looking at incredible expanses of time. All right, what else? What other kinds of stuff did our early ancestors make? Well, they made statues. They made sculptures. This is an image called, on the left, the Woman of Willendorf, and the image on the right is the Venus, or sometimes called the Woman of Lasko. So what are these? These are, the image on the left is the one that's really important. And I'm gonna change this up just a little bit so we can move this out of the way, and we can move this over a little bit so I'm not in the way. All right. Okay, back to your regular schedule programming. All right, so what's so important about this image over here on the left? Well, the Woman of Willendorf is the oldest sculpture, or was the oldest sculpture ever found when it was discovered in the early 1900s, so a little over 100 years ago, in Central Europe, in Austria, along the Danube River, near a town called Willendorf. This little statue was found. And this thing is not even 5 inches tall, so she's very small. She's like an action figure. But what is she? What does she do? Well, she is probably a fertility figure. If you look at her features, you can see that parts of her body have been emphasized. Specifically her breasts, her belly, and her genitals. And these all have to do with reproduction. But not only have those parts been emphasized, but parts that don't involve reproduction, her face, her tiny skinny little arms, her feet, which are almost non-existent, they've either been completely reduced or just erased altogether. So parts of that are important have been emphasized. How this figure was used, once again, we don't know. We're dealing with prehistory. She could be what we call a fetish, and fetish doesn't have the same terms as it does today. A fetish, in the anthropological sense of the word, a fetish simply means an object that is meant to have some sort of special power, right? Think of it as like a good luck charm in a way. Like modern day, you might have a lucky coin or a rabbit's foot or a horseshoe or something. That's in the scientific academic sort of way, the very definition of a fetish. Although I would not call it that to your friends because they'll look at you funny. Don't say I have a fetish for horseshoes. No, don't do that. But what we mean in the anthropological sense is this object that has special power. And this might have been carried around to ensure pregnancy. At a time where having babies was very difficult, infants were more likely not to survive than to survive. These things could have been really important. They could ensure pregnancy or assure a successful pregnancy or ensure that the child would be healthy. We don't know. And we don't know if they were used, like, if like, say, a woman carried these around and during, bedtime with her significant other, if she put this under the pillow or something to ensure that pregnancy would occur, or maybe she carried it around. We're not sure. Or maybe it was used in a ritual and made as an offering to a goddess or something. We don't know these. We don't know anything about what these people worshipped or what they believed. We just have very scant evidence, very tantalizing evidence. But we can make a pretty, I think, good guess here that this object is a fertility object. Over here in this image, this is a low relief or a bas relief, you know that term, sculpture. Most sculptures were freestanding, so they could be portable and small and carried around. We usually don't see large-scale sculpture. In fact, this is one of the largest, and it's a whopping 18 inches. So we're not talking about anything super huge here. But this is also permanently carved into. It was outside of a cave, so it is it's very unique and rare, but we see a very similar image of a woman with her reproductive parts emphasized. You also notice that she's holding a horn. Horns are really important in Paleolithic art. In fact, look at all the horned animals that we see in the Lasko scene here. Horns are representative of male power, right? Of also probably male fertility. So this is yet another fertility symbol, this image of this horn that she is holding. But if we kind of zoom out of history a bit, we start to realize that there is a trend. That you are looking at here on the right, a series of these sculptures that were found all over Europe. From France to Spain to Austria, some as far east as modern-day Russia, and even some places in North Africa. But still mostly the European or the Near European world. And these sculptures were made over a long period of time. Some of them are significantly older than the Venus, or I'm sorry, the Woman of Willendorf. Some of them date to 30, almost 40,000 years BC, and some of them are much newer and date up to 15,000 BC or BCE. What this tells us is that this image was consistent and prevalent, and that culture after culture after culture after culture utilize these images. Now, there's differences. The woman isn't always, sometimes her anatomy isn't always as enlarged as in others. Sometimes she has a face, sometimes she doesn't. She's in different positions. So there are changes because we're looking at tens of thousands of years of time. We're looking at cultures that changed, languages that changed, religious beliefs that changed over these various eras. So, but there is certainly a trend, isn't there? There is certainly a trend here. Now we're going to move from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. Neolithic literally means new Stone Age. And the Neolithic sort of begins around the end of the Ice Age. So around 11 or 12,000 BC, we start to see climate change, and the weather gets warmer. The climate gets warmer, and this means, though, that there's significant changes. A lot of the animals that humans in Europe had been hunting die off, or they migrate away. And so those food sources are no longer there. So the human beings in Europe go away, and Europe goes dark. And all of that cave art that we see stops. All those sculptures that we saw stop. And so we shift our attention now more towards the east. We're going to be looking at first of all, Turkey, and then we're going to be looking at the Middle East, or what we call Mesopotamia. So first of all, though, let's talk about a place called Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük is one of the earliest cities. It is a city with no streets, but the houses are clustered together, and access to all the houses would have been through the rooftops. But this is a very, very early city here. We're talking around 6,000 BC or so when this is created. It's not the oldest, but it's certainly one of the oldest. And what's starting to change here? What's causing people to start to build cities and create what we will know as civilization? Well, there's a debate among historians. Some historians believe that what happened was we discovered agriculture. We discovered animal husbandry and how to breed and raise animals, and we learned about farming, and we learned how to grow crops. And after doing this, we realized we don't have to be hunter-gatherers. We can stay in one place, we can stay in one place and grow our food here. That means we can build bigger things. That means we can build more complex places to live, and towns and villages and ultimately cities to live in, and our life and society will become more complex. We'll need to invent things like writing and economies and organized governments and religions to control these populations now living in urban areas. But there's another debate. There's a debate that says, no, the opposite happened. And there are some historians who say that we actually just got tired of moving around and we started to build more permanent dwellings. And that forced us to create agriculture. We realized, well, we don't want to move around, so what can we do now? Oh, we got to grow our own crops. We got to breed our own animals. So I don't know. I'm not an expert in this subject. I'm not a paleo agriculturalist. I don't know. But I do know there's a debate. But what's important for us is people stop moving around. When they stop moving around, they start to build bigger stuff. Welcome back to Chapter 3. We are going to continue looking at the art of early humankind. We started with the art of the Paleolithic period and then started looking at the art of the Neolithic period. This very early art from our most ancient ancestors, primarily in Europe. And then we see a shift because of climate change and because of a movement of peoples to new areas. And we see the rise of civilization in an area we call Mesopotamia during the Neolithic and into a period we call the Bronze Age. So let's take a look at Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is modern-day Iraq. It is located between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And there was a series of civilizations that rose and fell throughout Mesopotamia, from around the 3000s BC up through for the next few thousand years. We're going to see these civilizations kind of rise and fall. But they're all centered here along these rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. And we're going to really examine the earliest of these cultures, the sort of granddaddy of all civilizations, Sumer, S-U-M-E-R. So the ancient Sumerians were really the first civilization. They certainly didn't build the first towns or the first cities, but they were the first sort of organized civilization with all of the sort of attributes that go along with that. So large-scale religions and governments, complex societies with complex economies, and all of the things that sort of come along with a civilization, trade and war, and on a grand scale. And this all has to do with the invention of agriculture, which allowed people to settle down and to sort of grow crops or breed animals. And then this sort of mushroomed into a society and a civilization. So those civilizations, you need certain things, though, to make those civilizations adhere, to bring them together. And one of the things you need is writing. And so the Sumerians are one of the first cultures, if then not the first culture, to have writing. There's debate. Some scholars say actually Egypt might have had writing a little bit before the Sumerians. For many, many years it was taught that the Sumerians invented writing. Now there's debate. If they're not the first, they're certainly one of the first. And their invention of writing would have more or less coincided alongside Egypt's. So they had a type of writing called cuneiform, C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M, which evolved from pictures. So these early pictures, either called pictographs or pictograms, were symbols that represented concepts. And that's really all words are, right? They're symbols that represent concept. But these were pictorial symbols. They looked like the thing they represent, unlike modern day words, which don't. So, for example, the early Sumerian written word for bull looked like a bull's head, or the earliest food for bowl or food looked like a bowl of food. It was very literal. It was an actual picture of the thing. But over time, that became a more abstract design, much more like our modern languages. They used a stylus, this sort of wedge-shaped stylus that they would press into clay tablets to write in. So these clay tablets, which are rather thick and either dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, were very, very sturdy. They weren't very practical if you wanted to carry them around, but they were very, very sturdy. And many of them have survived. Thousands of them have survived. And because of this, we know a lot about the Sumerians. We know a lot about their religion. We know their stories, their epics. There's a story called Gilgamesh, which some of you have probably had to read in a world history course, or world literature course, I should say. There's epics of Gilgamesh. There's poetry. There's even boring things like sales receipts and business records of business and transactions and things like that. So it's a very well documented society, thanks to the invention of writing. So we are no longer in prehistory, we are in history. Woohoo! What kind of stuff did the Sumerians build? Well, they occasionally built fairly large things. The largest thing they built was called a ziggurat. Ziggurat. Ziggurats are these massive trapezoids that were religious structures. The Sumerians were a polytheistic society. Lots of gods, lots of goddesses. And there's a series of... The Sumerian civilization wasn't a unified nation, but it was a series of city-states that were dotted alongside the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And each one of these cities had their primary god or goddess. And generally in the middle of town, they would build this giant ziggurat, this sort of massive trapezoid. They were around 40 feet tall or so, but they were massive for the day. And on top of that is a temple or a shrine, where the priests would pray to the god or the goddess. These temples were exclusive. This isn't like a modern-day church or a mosque where you could just sort of wander in. This was the domain of the priest, because it was believed they were literally communicating with the god or the goddess, getting sort of divine information. So this is an architecture of exclusivity, right? They inside would usually have an altar where sacrifices could be made, altar, altar, which is a religious device used to make sacrifices. And underneath some of those altars, we have found what we call votive figures, V-O-T-I-V-E. Votive means it's a sign of devotion. It's a gift. It's an offering. Just like a votive candle is something you would light when you're offering a prayer. A votive figure are also offerings of prayer. These were found under the altar in a Sumerian temple, and they represent real people in a state of prayer. You'll notice that we have this cuneiform writing underneath, so we know that these were actual people. And you'll notice some of them are bigger than others. This is a term you already know, hierarchical or hieratic scale, the use of size to denote importance. We also see the large eyes, which represent a spiritual awakening or an awareness or a thoughtfulness. You know, think of the old lyric, I was blind but now I see, right? This idea of a spiritual awakening. So we know that the large statues represent important people, the smaller statues represent less important people, and that these are an offering of their prayer, a sign of their devotion. These are votive offerings. What other things do we know? We know that this is a funerary culture, F-U-N-E-R-A-R-Y, funerary, meaning related to death or funerals. And they buried their dead with what we call grave goods, stuff. Because it was believed that you could take this stuff with you into the next life. This is something that we mostly find in the graves of the elite classes, rulers, high priests, those kinds of things. This is what is known as the Standard of Ur. A standard is a banner carried into battle. Think of the Roman, you see movies with the Roman legion carrying the SPQR banner. It's similar, although this is actually not a standard. It's just a box, but for many years archaeologists mistook it as a standard, so we call it a standard even though it's not. You'll notice that image is divided on each side into 3 bands. These bands are called registers. And think of this as like early comic book panels. It's a way of taking a lot of images and dividing them up in a way that is very easy to read. These are images relating to a king. You can tell the king in each image because he is the largest. Thank you, hieratic scale. Here he is in the middle of this one side, and here he is on the end on the other. He's the biggest dude. He's the most important guy. One of these sides is the war side. One side is the peace side. The side on the left is war. We have images of chariots trampling enemies. We have images of soldiers holding weapons. This is meant to show the one of the sides of rulership, which is protection and conquest. The other side is peace, the ability to provide crops and a stable economy and all that other stuff you need to be a successful nation. And so we see images of peasants with food sources, animals, bags of grain, that kind of stuff. So war and peace, the 2 sides of rulership, are shown here. Sumer is other things found in Sumerian graves. Images of bulls. The image of the bull will never abate. We've seen images of bulls from the very, very, very beginning, or bison or other similar horned type animals, as a symbol of power, usually male power, aggressive male power, virility, that kind of stuff. That image of the bull will survive really up until the modern day. This image of sort of a masculine power. These are lyres, L-Y-R-E, are what are sometimes referred to as bull-headed lyres, which I've been called once or twice in my life. No, but a lyre is like an early harp, right? It's a stringed instrument, and so these were more likely associated with death and a death ritual. So it's appropriate that these are buried in a tomb. As part of as this concept of moving on to the afterlife. But these were buried with elite rulers. So this kind of stuff, these images of power with powerful animals, would not have been, you wouldn't have found this in the grave of your average Joe or Jane Sumerian. On the side of one of these bull-headed lyres is this rather funny image of various animals doing kind of human things. But at the top we see a rather fascinating image. We see an image of a man holding 2 bulls. This is more than likely a reference to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the big Sumerian epic, and it's a story about this powerful king who's kind of a jerk in the beginning, but he becomes a better person. But one of the things he does, he's sort of like the Hercules of ancient Sumer. In fact, his stories probably inspired Hercules, but he does all these awesome things. And one thing he does, he wrestles with this bull. So this is probably a reference to the story of Gilgamesh. But this is also a common symbol of power. This is something called the heraldic, H-E-R-A-L-D-I-C, heraldic stance, where you have a central figure holding 2 powerful animals. This is a symbol of power, of dominance over nature, of aggression, of strength. We'll see this image again with bulls, with lions, with snakes. It's often usually an image of a male figure, but not always. We will see some examples in later cultures with a female figure, but it's called the heraldic stance. So ancient Sumer rises and falls as it goes through many different conquests. Ancient Mesopotamia rises and falls as it goes through many ancient conquests. The Sumerians are replaced by a group called the Acadians. The Acadians are really one of the first empires with an emperor, with an absolute ruler. And the Acadian ruler was probably, this image we're seeing here is probably a ruler named Sargon. You'll notice that this in many ways is sort of the typical image of a king. So this is kind of the blueprint of kings, right here. This is early image, a guy with a beard, a crown, or some sort of headdress denoting power. So it's made with precious metals. So these are all symbols of power. And you'll notice his eyes have been ripped out because a subsequent conquering culture who conquered the Acadians gouged the eyes of this statue out. And that in itself is not uncommon. Oftentimes you will see one culture conquer another, and the first thing they do is they destroy images of the old power as a way of saying, we are now in charge. And so gouging out the eyes of the king, which probably also had precious jewels, was a huge statement here. After the Acadians, we have the Asyrians, who were a massive power and fierce and brutal rulers. They're symbols of power all over Assyrian art. This is an image of the ruler Arshonarsapal, who was Arshonarsapal was an Assyrian king. He is portrayed here as a creature called a Lama-Su. Lama-Su were these composite creatures made up of the body of a lion, eagle, and a bull horns with a human head, the portrait of the king. These are really tall images. This statue itself is over 10 feet tall. As a person, if you were standing next to this, your head would be right about here if you were about my height. So these are rather large images, and these were on the gates of the Assyrian palace, so you would pass through these. These are symbols of protection, symbols of power, symbols of the king. And notice how the animals are being used here are very typical of the animals that we have seen related to power all the way since the beginning of the Paleolithic period, 40,000 years beforehand. Bulls, powerful cats, and in this case, eagles. You know, notice he's not like an animal made up of like bunny rabbits, squirrels, and possums, right? Okay. Babylon. Babylon is another one of the great ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, known for its, of course, very famous hanging gardens. If you are sort of knowledgeable about the Old Testament, and especially the book of Daniel, Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar play a really big role there. These are known as the Ishtar Gates. Babylon was divided into several different districts, several different sections, and each section was dedicated to an ancient god. And many of the Mesopotamian gods were they were sort of variations of the gods that the original Sumerians worshipped. But the Babylonian gods, there were many of them, as there were in most ancient civilizations, all being polytheistic. Each district of the city was surrounded by a wall, and there was a giant gate that you had to go through. This thing is absolutely massive. It's like 70 feet tall and made up of thousands of bricks covered with a material called lapis lazuli, a very expensive blue mineral. And there's images of dragons and unicorns and lions. Oh my. Powerful animals representing the power of the king, the power of the goddess, in this case, the goddess Ishtar, who is a fertility goddess and kind of a war goddess and a lot of different things. Very important goddess in the ancient world. So we have our kind of standard representations of power here. Expensive materials, a large imposing size, and powerful animals. Equal power, right? Ancient Egypt. So we're moving 700-800 miles to the west. So we're moving out of Mesopotamia, and we're going to look at Egypt. Egypt is a culture that is fascinating because, well, many reasons. Its power, its art, its culture. But for me, it's length of the length of time that Egypt lasted. It is arguably the longest civilization in history, and it kind of depends on how we define civilization. Some say China lasted longer than Egypt because China's still around, which is true, but China has gone through incredible changes and grown and shrunk, and culturally it's a very different place now than it was 5,000 years ago. There's still an argument to be made. It just depends on how we sort of define what a civilization is. But Egypt is incredible because for 3,000 years it remained more or less a consistent civilization. There are ups and downs. There are a few years of foreign occupation, but for the most part, Egypt for 3,000 years maintained its cultural integrity. Why? Location. It's surrounded by desert is a big part of it. It is a culture that is river-based, as all other cultures are, based around some sort of body of water, in this case the Nile River. So they can control access into the country. And it's very much a monoculture. There's really only one people in Egypt, one ethnicity. So it could maintain, for a very long time, this sort of cultural stasis, right? Also, the Egyptians were very conservative in their beliefs. They didn't like change. They believed that if you change things too drastically, literally the universe would fall apart. Their entire belief is based on the movement of the flooding of the Nile River, which is very regular and very cyclical. Egypt is desert, but the Nile floods annually like clockwork, and when it floods, it leaves this sort of layer of silt, this really rich river soil, all over, on the farmlands adjacent to the riverbanks. And this provides, well, really fertile places to grow crops. It also means that the Egyptians are absolutely dependent on the Nile and on this idea of never-changing patterns and rhythms. And so this becomes embedded into their culture, this idea that change is bad. And if you do change things, like if the Nile doesn't flood, it could be disastrous. It could lead to the end of civilization. So if things change too much, the world could literally end. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So keep that in mind. So this means that the Egyptians are really reticent to change. They do change over time, because all civilizations do. But when we start looking at Egyptian art, you should, I hope you are sort of astounded with how regular things are for 3,000 years. Because basically what you're going to see in Egyptian art is consistency. Like, this is an image made from 3000 BC, and this is from 660 BC. These are almost 2,500 years apart. And yet they look strikingly similar. I mean, I can't think of any other culture. Let's look at another culture. Let's look at the city of Rome. And here is art made in Rome in the 1st century BC. And here's made in the early 20th century. So these are 2,000 years apart. And look at all of the changes in between. And that's 1,000 years fewer than we just saw in Egypt. Egyptians hated change, and they did everything they could to keep it from happening. I like to think of it this way. Think of like our own culture. Think of the United States, and think of the founding fathers and mothers of this nation. Think of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and images you've seen from that period of like powdered wigs and, like pants that go to your knee and women wearing corsets and big skirts and bonnets and things like that. And think about never changing that. And that was only 240 years ago. That was not that long ago. That's not even a tenth of the length of the rule of the Egyptians. All right? And imagine like dressing like George Washington or Martha Washington, not just for the last 240 years, but for the last 3,000 years. And I hope that gives you an idea of the unchanging nature, relative unchanging nature of the ancient Egyptians. Consistent and stable culture, only change slightly over time, difficult to change, all this stuff I just said. So there it is. So the Egyptians were a funerary culture, a major funerary culture. Death to them was the ultimate trip. Like literally, it was a trip that you prepared for your entire life. It wasn't something that you just, kind of packed a few bags for, but you build entire tombs. And especially if you're one of the powerful of ancient Egypt, like a pharaoh, the rulers, the kings of Egypt, then you would often be buried in elaborate tombs. And the pharaohs especially, because the pharaohs were thought to be a god. or half god. And when they died, they would ascend into heaven and join their father. Initially, pyramids were built by the pharaohs as a way of literally climbing to heaven. The three main pyramids located in the funerary city, or what is known as a necropolis, 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 which literally means city of the dead. Each one of these pyramids is dedicated to a pharaoh. They were covered initially with limestone, which mostly is gone now. So imagine these things not as sort of the brown, craggly shapes that we see today, but as these white, gleaming, smooth pyramids that could be seen for miles and miles and miles around. The pyramids are part of a much larger complex that involved temples. When a pharaoh died, their body was mummified and prepared and preserved, because it was believed the body had to be preserved for the soul to be able to be successful in its travels. And then that was taken across the Nile from the east to the west, from sunrise to sunset, from birth to death. And then this specially prepared body was then, more rituals were performed in a temple, and then eventually it was buried in the pyramid, a house for the dead. And these pharaohs were worshipped as gods after their death. So pretty crazy stuff, right? So the pyramids themselves were filled with some smallish chambers, but they're mostly filled with rubble on the inside. There's various chambers inside. Some of these are false chambers that were meant to deter thieves. But for the most part, there's really not a lot of room in here. I don't know if you could really describe these as buildings. They're more like structures with some rooms deep inside, but they're not. These aren't buildings that you could really function in. But they weren't meant for that. They were meant to be a place where the dead could reside. They weren't built for the living. So keep that in mind. The vast majority of objects that we will be looking at in ancient Egypt, let's go back. All the beautiful things, the things made of precious materials and all this different kinds of stuff, ivory, gold, silver, most of this was not made for living eyes to see, but it was made for the dead to help facilitate the travel from this world into the next world. The pyramids were monumental achievements. Here's some numbers. 25,000 total workers. These weren't generally slaves. The Greek historian Herodotus, partially some people believe to make the Egyptians look bad, said they used slave labor. But mostly this was volunteer labor. Really a part of like your civic duty. Think of it as kind of a manual labor tax. A lot of the workers were actually paid. Entire villages were built around the pyramids to house workers and their families. Entire sort of industries rose to provide for these workers. You can see like how much it took. Just the amount is amazing. I mean, they consume 21 cattle and 23 sheep sent daily from farms, plus grain and vegetables and water and places to live and clothing. I mean, this is some of the biggest building projects in the history of humankind, and they're massive. Where's my number of blocks here? You can, hundreds and thousands of different blocks were used. I've read statistics like if you took the blocks from just one of the pyramids, you could build a 10-foot wall around the country of Spain. So these are massive, massive structures. But they're meant to represent the power of the pharaoh, who is seen as a god. When the pharaoh died, he was worshipped as a god. And special statues called Ka statues were built. Ka, K-A. Ka is an aspect of the Egyptian soul. But this was believed to be sort of closer. This is more like the pharaoh's kind of like personality, right? And this is what is traveling to the afterworld. But it needed a statue, otherwise it would get lost. And these statues were put in temples and worshipped by priests, and they were treated like a living person. They were offered food, they were bathed, they were treated like a person, like the pharaoh himself. These statues were made from a hard material called diorite because you want to protect the integrity of the statue, because if it's damaged, then the ka could get damaged, and then you would have kaka, not ka. And so, you don't want these things to get broken, so you make them out of this really hard stone diorite, which had to be imported actually all the way from Mesopotamia. And then notice that you don't have any negative space because you don't want it to break off, so you have everything really tight and really close. Also, the pharaoh is young. Even though this pharaoh was actually fairly old when this statue was completed, the pharaoh is a god, so they're always portrayed as young. You'll notice also the god Horus, who is the protector god, Horus, is standing behind the pharaoh, literally getting his back, protecting him with his wings. Okay. The Egyptians often usually depicted their figures in what's called a composite view, meaning that angles are made up. The body is, let me start again, rewind. The body is shown from multiple angles simultaneously. So you've seen this in Egyptian art your entire life. The head is often shown in profile, but the torso is shown facing us, right? The legs are sideways. This is impossible. A person cannot stand like this unless you just literally sever their spine. But what the Egyptians were doing were trying to show the body parts from every recognizable angle, because that's how we think of the body. That's how we conceive of the body, right? When you think of a hand, you think of a hand like this. Nobody thinks of a hand like that. You think of a hand like this or something, from a recognizable angle. Same way with a head. You think of a head from here or in profile. Nobody hardly ever thinks of a head from a 3/4 view. Same way with an eye. When you think of an eye, you think of an eye from straight on. Nobody ever thinks of, oh, I really like my wife's eyes from the side, right? So even if you show somebody in profile, you show their eye looking at you from the side of their head. This is called a composite view because the body is composited of multiple viewpoints. Here we have an image of a governor. This is from a tomb. The Egyptian elite were buried with often very elaborate tombs with many grave goods. I mean, we're talking thousands of grave goods sometimes. Because the idea is you literally take it with you. You need clothes, you need food, and you need stuff to do. So if you like to hunt, you bring weapons. If you like to play games, you bring cards, right? If it's something that's too big to bring into a tomb, then you will paint pictures of the person doing that on the wall. So if a person likes to hunt, you paint pictures of them hunting. This is an image of a ruler, a guy named Nebaman, and you can see him and his family portrait with his wife, his child, his son. Children typically were nude until they reached puberty, and then they wore clothes. That was how you can always tell a youth is they're nude in Egyptian art. And then we have the animals. Now let's take a look at this really closely. Notice how rigid and unrealistic the Egyptian bodies are. They look like geometric shapes. They're completely unrealistic. They're this composite view, and they're also not showing any emotion, and they are all young and perfect. But contrast that with the animals that look lifelike, that are shown from often complex angles, that have curves, that have organic shapes and forms, that behave in much less rigid ways. I mean, look at this cat with this very, curving S-curve shaped sort of spine and tail. Look how naturalistic and realistic it looks and the birds look compared to the people. Why? Well, that tells us something. It tells us that the Egyptians could actually make things look real if they wanted to. But with human beings, they didn't. Because most of the art that we see of human beings is made for tombs. It's funerary art and has a very strict religious purpose. And that is to get the soul into heaven safely. And there is also a sense of reverence. There is a sense of decorum. There is a sense of propriety about these images. You can't show people being laughing or being goofballs or being out of shape, because this is their body for eternity. There's a solemnity, right? There's a solemnness to these bodies. How do we know so much about these Egyptians? Well, they left writing. But it wasn't really until the early 1800s that we could decipher this writing. And thanks to Napoleon and his conquest of everybody, he invades Egypt, and this stone, the Rosetta Stone, is discovered. Yes, this is where the software gets its name. The Rosetta Stone has 3 languages, all saying the same thing on it. It has 2 basically versions of ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. We had already been able to translate one of the ancient Greek writings, and so we could translate the other 2. This gave us an incredible amount of information about ancient Egypt now. We could understand the hieroglyphs, we could understand what they meant, and so the Rosetta Stone really serves as a template for all of our knowledge of the Egyptian language afterwards. And this is why the language software is called the Rosetta Stone. So the Egyptians were buried, and they buried themselves, they mummified themselves as a way of preserving the body, which helped preserve the soul. Not all of the organs were kept within the body, because the organs are actually wet and mushy, and they would make the body decompose faster. So certain organs were taken out and stored in what are called canopic jars. Canopic jars, each one represents a certain god. You don't have to know what these are, but each god was associated with a different organ, and these were thought to help preserve the body, but also help with, they were part of the ritual that prepared the body, that made it travel safely to the afterworld. So remember how I just told you that Egyptian art never changed? I lied. I absolutely lied. But it wasn't a big lie. It was a little fib. Because Egyptian art did change radically and deeply, but for a brief 20-year period of time. So around 1353 BC, a ruler named Akhenaten became pharaoh. And Akhenaten said, you know what? I'm not going to worship all of these other gods. I'm going to worship one god. That god's name is Aten. He is the disk of the sun itself. And we're all going to worship him now and get rid of the other gods. And I am the son of Akhenaten. And I'm going to change everything. I'm changing our religion. I'm changing our gods. I'm building a new city dedicated to the sun. And I'm going to change our art and how we do everything. So look at this image. This is an image of Akhenaten and his wife, the Queen Nefertiti, and their daughters. Let's compare this to the image that we've seen before of another Egyptian family. First of all, look, gone is that rigid geometric forms, and instead we get a much more organic, curvilinear kinds of forms and lines. Much more realistic behavior. We see bodies slouching. We see more realistic bodies. We see bellies. We see folds in the skin. We also see emotion. We see smiles. We see a connection, maybe even love. So we're seeing something radical and different, because Akhenaten wanted to let everybody know that something is new. We're not doing things the same old way, and he changed the art. He made art more naturalistic, more realistic. If we look over here, let me move my, I'm going to put myself right in the center. Hey! Okay. If we look at these 2 busts, we can see also how much the art has changed. The image on the left is of Tia, who was Akhenaten's mother. And if you look at her, first of all, you'll notice that she's being portrayed as old. Whereas most rulers were portrayed as eternally young and youthful, she is shown as she has lines. She's obviously a woman in her later middle age. And we also can see her personality. And boy, oh boy, you don't want to mess with Tia. But if we look over here on the right, we can see the Queen Nefertiti, one of the most famous images from ancient Egypt, designed by an artist named Thutmose. It's rare that we have the name of an artist, but his workshop survived, actually, and this was left inside of it. So it's unfinished. That's why she's missing an eye. But, you know, generally we don't know the names of most artists in the ancient world because they weren't important. What they made art of was important, but the artists themselves were not. But here we see something remarkable. Look at the realism. Look at the bone structure in Nefertiti's face. Look at the way the artist has portrayed the tendons in her neck. Look at the way he's portrayed the muscles in her mouth, creating this sly, elegant smile. Not only are we getting, I think, an actual portrait of Nefertiti, not just sort of a symbol of Nefertiti, but an actual, like, this is probably close to what she looked like. We're also getting her personality, her emotion, her je ne sais quoi, right? Her being here. I mean, in many ways, we're looking at some of the first, what you could call portraits. These aren't symbols of a person. These are actual attempts to recreate a person's demeanor and appearance. This is like miles away from anything we've ever seen before. In the 40,000 years of art that we've seen before this, we don't have anything like this. This is incredible stuff, guys. All right. So Akhenaten dies. Maybe killed. He was not popular. Because here you have one of the most traditional conservative societies in history, and this dude comes in and goes, I'm changing everything. Do you think they just went, yeah, that's fine by me? No. It was a disaster. And so he dies, and images of Akhenaten are torn off the walls. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, we call this period of Akhenaten's rule the Amarna period. The Amarna period. So if I didn't say that before, my apologies. So King Tutankhamun is a son of Akhenaten. And he's a nobody. He's not even the son of Akhenaten's main wife, Nefertiti. He's another one of his wife's son. But why do we know so much about this king? A king who did nothing, who was dead by the age of 19, a king who accomplished no great feats, won no wars, made no great changes or contributions to Egyptian society. Why do we know so much about him? We know so much about him because when his tomb was discovered in 1923, it was almost fully intact. Nothing like this had ever been found before. Over 5,000 objects were discovered in his tomb, mostly untouched. The Egyptians had actually stopped burying people in pyramids, and in the later eras had started burying their dead underground because grave robbers mercilessly robbed these tombs. And most of these tombs have long, for thousands of years, been empty. But King Tut is special because it was not. And even this nobody king, this minor king, who probably suffered from inbreeding, who had some severe health conditions and health problems, even he was buried with the most luxurious items you could possibly ever imagine. A golden coffin, a mask made of gold and lapis lazuli. So why gold? Why gold? Why is gold so important in the ancient world and even today, especially with religious imagery? Because gold is often thought to be a divine substance. Gold is a metal, but it doesn't tarnish, doesn't rust. It is eternal and perfect, just like the divine is eternal and perfect. And if you are a pharaoh, this mask that was placed over your mummy is your mask in the afterworld. It is your face, I should say, in the afterworld. This is what you look like when you become a god. You are golden. You are a golden god. So it's important that these masks were made of gold, because that is the face of the pharaoh in the afterlife. There were also written on the back of the mask spells to protect the pharaoh and to ensure that his travels to the afterlife were safe. I mean, the rituals that were performed over in ancient Egyptian bodies, especially those of the elite and especially those of Pharaoh, could last weeks and weeks and weeks. A lot of care was put into these. In fact, so much preparation was put in that, when the Pharaoh was born, work on his, or in rare cases her, there's a few female pharaohs, was instituted from the very beginning. Okay, we're going to stop there, and when we come back to the next video, we're going to be looking at the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. See you then.